I'll get to, the Labour policies in a minute, but we've just heard from Brandon Lewis. He says he's got full confidence in the Sue Gray report, despite the allegations in the Sunday Times this morning. Do you?
Well, I have to say the one person that sadly we don't have confidence in is the Prime Minister. We now know because of that report that he repeatedly lied to Parliament, and his response, as we've seen over the last just couple of days, has been to try and actually change the rules that he will then be judged by, because he's seeking to water down the ministerial code. That's the big issue here, and that's what Labour's focused on, because for as long as we have Boris Johnson at the head of government currently, we actually aren't seeing many of the big issues being gripped onto by the Conservatives. That government continues to be in chaos, and ultimately working people are paying the price.
At the same time, though, you're talking there about how Boris Johnson's tried to, change the ministerial code that he'll be judged by. It is important to say, though, isn't it, that the most serious offences, so misleading Parliament, what Boris Johnson has been investigated for, that would still be a resignation issue. So he wouldn't necessarily benefit himself from the changes that he's making.
Well, unfortunately, he has not resigned. I mean, ultimately, that is a sanction that's in the existing
found
code,
guilty yet, has he?
He has not applied it. Well, I think most people would draw their own conclusions, frankly, seeing what's in.
It'd be a bit strange for him to resign before the investigation's completed,
his repeated denials. Well, ultimately, I think you're seeing many Conservative MPs themselves having taken that decision. Not enough of them, I would say. But when it comes to the reform of the ministerial code, I think the difference is very, very clear. You've got Boris Johnson having removed the words integrity, accountability, honesty, even from the foreword to that code. As I say, he has watered down the sanctions. It used to be previously the case that any breaking of the ministerial code would be a resignation issue. Now there are other sanctions that have been put in there, even just apologising, where surely that would be the very first thing that we would expect. That's not a sanction, that's just what ministers should do as a function of course if they're found to have broken the rules. So we will be forcing a vote on this. We think that ultimately politics should be clean, they should be a force for good. We should have all politicians held to high standards. That's why we're calling for that vote.
OK. I'm keen to talk a little bit about the cost of living crisis, because we saw, as I said in the introduction to you, we saw the Conservative response this week, and it was widely welcomed. The IFS called it a big, expensive package, which is hugely redistributive, taking from high earners and giving to the poor. The Resolution Foundation said it rightly prioritises those hit hardest by the cost of living crisis. You must welcome the action that's been taken.
Well, of course, after 5 months of calling for that windfall tax, finally, we are relieved that the government appears to have listened, at least on that subject. But we are concerned that there doesn't seem to be any plan now to deal with the causes of that cost of living crisis. Yes, some action to deal with its symptoms that we've called for, as I said, for many months, but not action to deal with its causes. I mean, again, Labour's called for many, many months now for a home insulation programme. That would take £400 off people's bills, not just this year, but in subsequent years into the future as well. Again, the other measures that we need to see being taken for our energy security. Labour's called, for example, for a doubling of onshore wind, for a tripling of solar, and for an end to the government's delay on new nuclear. We need those measures to be taken urgently, because they will deal with the causes of some of this cost of living crisis and not just the symptoms. It seems with this government, they tend to be dragged kicking and screaming to action at the last minute. We need to see those longer term plans now.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I do sometimes feel, listening to Labour, that you want the government to go a little bit more quickly on things that it's already doing. When it comes to nuclear, you're sort of saying that they want to speed it up, but the government has committed to a nuclear strategy. If the big idea is, homes insulation, that's something that politicians have spoken about for an awfully long time. I mean, you're head of Labour's policy review that was launched in June 2021, so it's been running for a year now. We're currently facing an absolute cost of living crisis, inflation at a 40-year high, potentially the biggest drop in living standards since records began. What is the single transformative idea that you've come up with in this year-long policy review?
Well, we've come up with many ideas. If people are particularly interested, they can look at our reports on the Labour website. And I have to say that the core idea for Labour is, right now, when it comes to that cost of living crisis, as I said, not just dealing with the symptoms. We set out that windfall tax policy. It took the government 5 months to contemplate it. They said that it was unconservative. They said they wouldn't enact it. They've been dragged kicking and screaming to put it into place. But we're saying, right, we've got to deal with those causes as well. You know, we just talked about energy security and Labour's plan there.
Yeah, just to come in, because I did ask you for the one
for growth.
Sorry to interrupt. I did ask for the one transformative policy. What is it?
Well, I was just going to say, and sorry, it is difficult when we're not in the same place, but I was going to say when it comes to growth, when we've had such low growth under Conservative-led governments compared to under previous Labour governments, that we're very clear we've got to buy, make and sell more in our country. And that's what Rachel Reeves has been setting out. If we do that, then we can build growth back up again, because we've had far too low levels of economic growth. That's holding back people's living standards, and we've set out exactly how we would be delivering that. So it really is Labour that's the party of ideas now. The Conservatives have been dragged along in the wake of what Labour has been setting out there. And that's a big problem, because people are right up against it right now, and they need to see a government that's on their side. They don't have that at the moment.
OK. I just want to move on to your Women and Equalities brief to end. Stella Creasy, the Labour MP, said in an interview with Telegraph yesterday, "Do I think that women were born with penises? Yes." Do you agree with her?
Well, no, I don't agree with her. Biological females obviously aren't. Of course, there are also trans women who've made a transition in their gender, but sex is not the same as gender. But I would say that obviously I have a huge amount of respect for my colleague Stella Creasy. She's done a huge amount of campaigning for women. But on that issue around biology, I do have a different opinion.
It's interesting, this debate, and you know, the last thing you want to do is just to kind of try and get the kind of shock questions or anything like that in. But there is a genuine debate that's being had on what trans policy means more widely. Suella Braverman, the Attorney General, gave an interview with The Times this weekend where she was speaking about how schools should accommodate trans pupils. And of course, this is a live debate. You know, the Education Secretary is drawing up guidance on single-sex spaces. So she was asked whether pupils who are born male should be able to use girls' lavatories or changing facilities. And she said, "I would say to the school that they don't have to and that they shouldn't. They shouldn't allow that child to go into girls' toilets. I think protecting single-sex spaces for biological females and biological males is really important, particularly in schools." What's your position on that?
Well, of course, it was Labour that created the Equality Act that provides the legal background for those single-sex spaces where they're needed. But I have to say, I find this incredibly frustrating. I mean, as you mentioned, the government said that it would produce guidelines to help schools, to help teachers on these issues. They haven't produced those guidelines. Instead, you've got ministers who are taking up their time talking about these different issues, sounding off on them, not providing those guidelines. And quite frankly, our Attorney General, when she's presiding over such low levels, record low levels of prosecutions for rape, and actually making the situation worse now by allowing actually the notes from counselling sessions for rape victims to be used to attack the credibility of those victims. I think she should get a grip on that issue and focus on it. And ultimately, if she's concerned about the situation in schools, she should be getting her education colleagues to hurry up and produce the guidelines that they said they would provide, because all children need to be safe in school.